Good day, viewers. My name is Philip Muziri from the Southern African Parliamentary Support Trust, or Sapst. Today we are discussing Constitutional Amendment Number 2 Bill, which is pending before Parliament. The bill was gazetted in January of 2020, and in terms of the Constitution, at least 90 days must elapse between gazetting and introduction in Parliament. And between that gazetting and introduction, certain things must happen for constitutional bills. While for ordinary bills, only 14 days are required to elapse between gazetting and introduction, for constitutional bills, at least 90 days must elapse. And during that period, the Speaker is required to invite members of the public and other stakeholders to make their input into the bill. As you will be aware, the Speaker has made invitations to stakeholders to make their input into the bill. The Speaker does so in fulfillment of the requirements of Section 141 of the Constitution, which requires that Parliament must involve stakeholders in its legislative and other processes. So, what is it that this particular bill contains? This bill contains a number of issues that will alter certain provisions of the Constitution. For instance, whilst under the current framework, the two vice presidents are appointed by the president and serve at his pleasure, in 2023, the Constitution transitional mechanisms required that there be a running mate system in terms of which two presidential vice presidents would stand as candidates for the vice presidency. These would be elected directly by voters at the elections. What the amendment to that particular provision will do is that the vice presidents will be appointed by the president as under the current provision. So what the amendment will do is to ensure that the president will appoint the two vice presidents who will serve at his pleasure. They will be appointed and disappointed by the president. That is one of the fundamental changes that is coming courtesy of this particular bill. There are other changes that the bill also contains. For instance, whereas under the current framework, the women's quota was supposed to end under the current Parliament, meaning that in 2023, the women's quota of 60 women elected on a proportional basis was going to fall away. In terms of this amendment, that quota will be maintained for the next two parliaments, meaning that for 4 parliaments after the assumption of this particular constitution, we will have a women's quota of 60 women appointed on a proportional basis. This is meant to address the gender disparity that has existed in this country. So the 60 women will continue to be there because the current provision's lifespan will be extended by the amendment. In addition, what the amendment will also do in terms of the representation of young people is to introduce 10 seats for young people who will be incorporated into the National Assembly. So what the amendment will do is to expand the number of representatives in the National Assembly from the 210 elected directly by voters plus the 60 women elected on a proportional basis. There will also be an additional 10 young persons who will be elected on a proportional basis based on the representation of the political parties as elected by voters in the National Assembly. So the same methodology that is used to elect the 60 women elected on proportional basis will also be used in order to elect the 10 young persons. In terms of gender parity for the 10 young persons, They will also be elected using the zebra listing system, where political parties will be required to submit names with male followed by female and so on. So it will in part address that gender parity. What is peculiar, however, about this particular provision is that whereas the appointment or election of the 60 women will continue for the next 4 parliaments, that of young persons is likely to continue into the future. The other change that this particular provision will bring is to say that for the election of for the appointment of judicial officers into higher courts, under the current framework, the Chief Justice and his deputy are appointed by the President on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. It is intended under the proposed changes that this same method will also apply to judicial officials that will be appointed to the superior courts. In other words, the changes mean that the public appointment system, in terms of which the judicial officers are publicly interviewed, will change for purposes of this particular appointment process. In addition to the issue in respect of the changes that are coming in respect of this particular amendment, the executive are entitled to appoint ministers that are members of parliament. Under the current provision in the Constitution, the President may appoint up to 5 ministers that are not members of parliament. What this amendment does is to increase that number from 5 to 7 who are appointed on the basis of their professional skills and competence. So the number of ministers that the President may appoint from outside of parliament will increase thanks to this particular amendment. This will increase the areas from which the President can appoint ministers. In addition to these particular changes, there's also a provision under the Constitution that links the issue of delimitation of constituencies to the process of the census. Zimbabwe carries out a population census every 10 years. So what the provision says is that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, or ZEC, is required to delimit constituencies immediately after a population census is conducted. However, the provision also says that if the process of the census is completed 6 months before an election, the results of that particular census will not be utilized for the forthcoming election. So there has been a problem in that our dates for the census have always sort of created a problem, in the sense that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has not been able to utilize the latest data based on the census. What the provision will do is that it will delink the population census from the delimitation exercise, meaning that the Commission may delimit electoral boundaries without data from the census. However, it must be noted that population figures are critical for purposes of ensuring equality of votes. That is principally one of the reasons why the delimitation process was linked to the population census. Then one of the other changes is that the civil service will be transformed from civil service into the public service. I think this is a reversion to the original position. Under the old Constitution, what we call the civil service now was called the public service. So we'll revert to that, and the role of the public service as it will be to deliver public services to the people, as well as to conduct public administration. So this is one of the key changes that will happen. In addition to that, the Chief Secretary to the President and Cabinet is, under the current framework, part of the public service. His position is not a constitutional appointment under the current constitutional provisions. However, the amendment will make the Chief Secretary a constitutional appointee appointed by the President and will serve at the pleasure of the President. And in addition to that, the Chief Secretary will be the highest in terms of the people that are appointed as permanent secretaries. All secretaries will report to the Chief Secretary of the Cabinet. One of the other changes that is also coming courtesy of the amendment is the reintroduction of the Office of the Public Protector. Zimbabweans will recall that in a previous constitutional arrangement, we had the Office of the Public Protector, who had in earlier stages been called the Ombudsman. That office was abolished when the 2013 Constitution came into force. What the changes mean is that that office will be reintroduced. We have a public protector. The functions of the public protector will be hived off from the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. What it therefore means is that there will be a configuration or a reconfiguration of the functions of the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, with some of the functions going to the Office of the Public Protector, who will deal with public complaints in respect of the conduct of executive institutions. So the Public Protector will be reintroduced. The Prosecutor General under the current Constitution is appointed through a public appointment process that involves public interviews. The constitutional amendment will change that to a position where the Prosecutor General will be appointed by the President on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. There will be other changes as well that arise from the amendment, which include changes to the clauses under the current Constitution on devolution. Some of the changes imply that whereas executive mayors were to be the chairpersons of the councils that arise from the introduction of the devolution clauses, the chair for those councils will now be elected positions. They will no longer be automatic positions. The other change is also that members of parliament who were going to be members of those metropolitan councils will no longer be members of those metropolitan councils. This is a fundamental change, and will also make a different complexion to the councils that result from this particular constitutional amendment. The last important change that arises from this constitutional amendment that I will make reference to today under clause 23 is one that relates to international agreements. Under the current framework, all international agreements, whether by Zimbabwe with foreign organizations or with foreign governments or international organizations, require parliamentary approval. The clause that will change that constitutional dispensation, which is clause 23, will remove agreements entered into by Zimbabwe and foreign organizations, meaning that Parliament will not have a right to approve those international agreements with foreign organizations. And that is also an important change coming from this constitutional amendment. Having made reference to all these changes that are coming, I've made reference to a few of the most important changes. I need also to then deal with issues of the process that the bill will go through. Parliament is currently preparing to go out to all corners of the country in order to seek public views on the bill. That is a requirement of Section 141 of the Constitution, which enjoins Parliament to engage stakeholders for parliamentary processes. Parliament has flighted advertisements on all sorts of media with a view to informing its stakeholders on this current process. Indeed, the process was disrupted. Parliament had originally invited members of the public to submit written submissions to Parliament on this particular bill. That advertisement has been reflighted again because that process is now commencing in earnest. What is going to happen is that the Committee on Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs will go to all corners of the country starting next week to invite submissions, comments, and other views from stakeholders on the bill. Those that live or stay in areas far away from places where the committee will visit can still make their submissions. These submissions can be written and may be submitted as hard copy submissions or as soft copy submissions directed to the Clerk of Parliament, who is the Secretary to the Institution of Parliament. So all Zimbabweans are entitled to make their contributions to the process. No one is barred from making their submissions. So whilst we must all keep safe under the COVID-19 conditions, we are still entitled as Zimbabweans to make our submissions to the lawmaking process as envisaged by the Constitution. So that's the process that Parliament is going through commencing next week. Thereafter, the committee will then consolidate the views of stakeholders and submit a report to Parliament, because the committee is a delegate of the House of Parliament and it must report back on the findings that it makes from the submissions that it will start receiving next week. So all Zimbabweans are welcome to make their submissions to the Clerk of Parliament at the Parliament of Zimbabwe, 3rd Street and Kwame Nkrumah in Harare. And if you want to make an email submission, you can also write to the clerk through the address of the clerk, which is clerk@powzim.gov.zw. So there you have it, Zimbabweans. Make your difference, add to the process, enrich the process of constitution making, and make a contribution. That is all I wanted to say on this particular bill. Thank you very much.